Your brain doesn't experience your fingers equally. Some fingers occupy massive neural territory, others barely register. This isn't metaphor, it's measurable cortical real estate, mapped in the sensory cortex with extreme precision. Your thumb and index finger dominate that map. Your ring finger and little finger barely exist in comparison. The brain is literally biased in how it processes your hands. Modern neuroscience calls this cortical mapping. Large surface area in the sensory cortex means high-resolution feedback, more nerves, more data, more control, more influence on attention and motor regulation. The hand isn't just a tool, it's a high-density neural interface. Here's the part most people miss. Ancient yogic systems didn't need brain scans to notice this. They observed behavioral effects, attention changes, breath changes, mental stability, emotional quieting. They mapped function, not anatomy. Not through mysticism, but through long-term pattern observation, repetition, cause and effect, regulation, response. What neuroscience now visualizes with imaging, yogic systems described through structure. In the brain, fingers are not neutral inputs. They are active sensory regulators. When specific fingers touch, press, or stabilize against each other, they alter sensory input patterns. That sensory input feeds directly into neural feedback loops. The brain constantly updates its internal state based on this data. Change the input, and you change the regulation output. This is basic neurophysiology. The sensory cortex receives input, the motor cortex responds, the nervous system adapts, attention shifts, breath patterns shift, muscle tone changes, thought speed changes, not symbolically, mechanistically. This is why hand positioning affects mental state. Mudras are not rituals. They are structured sensory input systems. They reduce random sensory noise and replace it with stable, repetitive neural signals. That creates predictability for the nervous system. Predictability is regulation. When you bring fingers together in specific configurations, you create closed sensory circuits. This reduces chaotic input from the hands and increases coherent feedback to the brain. That coherence stabilizes attention systems. It anchors awareness. It reduces dispersion. At the same time, posture and hand position affect breathing mechanics. Shoulder tension changes, chest openness changes, diaphragm movement changes. That shifts breath rhythm. Breath rhythm directly influences nervous system state through vagal pathways. Slow, stable breathing increases parasympathetic dominance. Faster, shallow breathing increases sympathetic activation. This is not abstract. This is physiology. Breath interacts with the nervous system. The nervous system interacts with attention. Attention interacts with emotional regulation. Emotional regulation feeds back into breath. This is a closed loop. Hand position enters that loop through sensory input. This is why neural feedback loops matter. The system isn't linear, it's circular. Sensory input to neural processing, to autonomic response to breath modulation, to attention regulation, to sensory perception. Mudras sit at the sensory input point of the loop. They are neural anchors. They reduce sensory noise. They stabilize motor output. They regulate feedback intensity. They provide consistent tactile input that the brain can lock onto. That creates attentional stability without force, without suppression, without cognitive strain. Over time, repeated patterns reshape neural pathways. This is neuroplasticity. The brain adapts to repeated input. Consistent sensory patterns create consistent neural responses. Consistent neural responses create predictable internal states. This is not conditioning through belief. It's conditioning through repetition. This is also why finger mapping matters. High-density cortical areas have more regulatory influence. Thumb and index finger connections have stronger neural representation. Using them changes the feedback intensity. Different combinations create different regulatory effects, not because of symbolism, because of sensory bandwidth. Modern neuroscience measures this. Yogic systems structured it. Not superior, not mystical. Parallel logic systems. One uses instruments, one used observation, one uses imaging, one used pattern recognition. Same nervous system, same biology, different language. Mudras work as regulation tools because they simplify the sensory environment. The brain is constantly overwhelmed with input. Visual noise, auditory noise, cognitive noise, proprioceptive noise, mental noise. Stability comes from reduction, not stimulation. Reducing sensory chaos allows the nervous system to downshift. That's regulation. This is why stillness works. This is why posture matters. This is why breath matters. This is why attention focus matters. This is why hand positioning matters. Not because of belief, because of systems interaction. When you stabilize the body, the nervous system stabilizes. When the nervous system stabilizes, the mind stabilizes. When the mind stabilizes, attention becomes coherent. When attention becomes coherent, internal noise decreases. Mudras are part of that stabilization architecture. They are not standalone tools. They are part of a regulation stack. Posture, breath, attention, sensory input, neural feedback. Used together, they create internal coherence. Used alone, they still provide measurable regulation. This produces grounded outcomes: nervous system regulation, attention stability, emotional modulation, stress response reduction, cognitive quiet, breath stabilization, smoother sleep transitions, mental stillness without suppression. Not transformation, not healing, not awakening. Regulation, control of internal noise, stability of internal systems. Ancient yogic systems didn't talk about sensory cortex or neural mapping because they didn't have that language. They talked about structure, positioning, discipline, repetition, and internal steadiness. Modern neuroscience doesn't talk about mudras. It talks about neural input, feedback loops, sensory processing, autonomic balance, and neuroplastic adaptation. Different vocabularies, same organism. The brain hasn't changed in thousands of years. Only our instruments have. What looks like tradition is often just early system modeling. What looks like science is often just refined observation. The hand isn't symbolic, it's neurological. The fingers aren't decorative, they're sensory regulators. Mudras aren't rituals, they're structured neural inputs. When you understand that, the practice changes. Not as belief, not as faith, as system design. Not mysticism, neurobiology in physical form.